Hi, I'm Tom and welcome to the Welsh Woodman Workshop. In tonight's video we're going to be making this Japanese inspired bench using some traditional hand joints. So this bench is going to be going into the remembrance corner of my school's nursery garden. Sadly a pupil passed away rather suddenly from sepsis and I said I'd make them a memorial bench to go in the garden. So I hope you pick up a few tips and tricks along the way and really enjoy tonight's video. One of the best pieces of advice that I was given when I was in university making furniture is to draw all the parts out to scale or even create some cardboard mock-ups. That allows you to look at the proportions, the angles and gauge whether it looks right for the design. It also allows me to gauge where my joints are going to go and I can plan out that then in the design before sort of figuring it out as I'm going along. An alternative to this is to use a CAD modelling software, something like SolidWorks or Google SketchUp to model out the design. We've gone with the traditional approach today, which has allowed me to create a cutting list of parts and measurements and quantities to mark out and cut the pieces. Now I've got my tape measure out there ready. Now I found that if you measure from the centre, the tape measure can be a little bit of a wonk and you won't get an accurate measurement. So I'm always trying to bring my tape measure towards the end and I can mark out fairly accurately then. So put a little dot at my required measurement. Then I can use a tri-square to draw a 90-degree line ready for this to be cut out. I'm going to cut all my parts at the same time and that will really improve my efficiency throughout the project. So the first step in making the bench, we're going to be making two side pieces. And we're going to be putting these together using some traditional stopped mortise and tenon joints and some draw boring to make sure they're nice and tight. So we're going to go through those processes now. So to maximise the material, I'm going to be doing a little angled cut. Now in order to get this curved back profile, which will account to like the spines. When you lean back, there's nothing more uncomfortable than just a straight seat. So I've got a 9-degree taper there going back to allow it to be comfortable to sit on. So I'm going to cut off a triangle section. I'm going to flip that round and then glue it onto the back. So I'm using the bandsaw to cut off the section, run that through the plane, and I'm drilling some oversized holes in this so I can plug it with dowels later on. Some Gorilla Glue to fasten it, and I'm using some screws to clamp this as it is at an awkward angle. I'll remove the screws and use some dowels later on. So we're going to be making some tenon joints to go into our mortises that we're going to create later. Now I'm going to be marking these up. So I'm going to be using a piece of Dressel round timber. So it's already pretty square, but I'm going to look at the edges. I'm going to try and get the squarest edge and make that my face side. So of all the edges, this edge seems to be the squarest. So I'm going to do my marking out from that edge. So all my measurements is going to be off that edge. So I'm going to come in 40mm either side for the shoulder. I'll be using a tri-square to draw my 90-degree lines across. Lines down. I found a far more accurate way of marking these lines across. Just do a little dot, join them up with a ruler. Like so, the same the other side. Okay, I've got a marking gauge and I could set this marking gauge to the thickness of the joint I want. So you can see it there on this one. And I'm just going to hold this and score away from me, and what I'll do is I'll do it with the old pencil. So another carpentry trick there, just so you can see better on the camera, but that's how you do it at home. So the advantage with the marking gauge is it leaves a crisp line that you can put your saw or chisel just the other side of to pare back to your line. Obviously this will make it easier for you guys to see. I'm going to show you a couple of ways we can cut these out. The first way, I'm going to cut it by hand using a Japanese pull saw, just cutting on the outside of the lines and not on the lines itself, because I can pare back to the lines with a chisel later on. So I do my rip cuts first with the grain, then I like to do the cross cuts afterwards. So rip cuts again down to my marking out lines, then I do the cross cuts to remove the material that I need. And by doing it this way and chiseling afterwards, you'll get a nice crisp tenon joint. Now another way, you can use a chop saw to a depth gauge and cut a series of grooves, then use the chisel to mark back to the correct lines that you've marked onto your work. Here's the tenon after it's been sort of paired with the chisel. And you notice I've got a really nice shoulder that's going to allow some glue to hold the joint together. Lots and lots of surface area, so that makes it a really strong joint for putting furniture together. Notice the shoulders themselves are dead flat across there, because that's going to be your mating face into the up beams. So we need to make sure that it's flat. If it's not flat, it's going to be wonky or at a slight angle. I'm just using my cardboard templates now to mark out where I want the mortise joints to go. I'm using the thickness of the material to help me do that. Centre lines on the board to make sure my mortises are centred. And I'm just marking a centre line as well on the joint itself, so I can get them lined up exactly into the centre and score around them. Labelling up your joints is essential, so you don't want to mix up the joints later on. So I've got the mortises marked up, ready for the tenons. I'm going to be drilling some holes to begin with. Then I'm going to be chiselling these out all by hand. So I've got a spade bit on my pillar drill. I'm going to drill down to the required depth. And I'm going to be using a chisel then. I like to start my chisel cuts across the grain, as you're less likely to have a board split along its length than if you're chiseling with the grain. So those cut marks will stop the board splitting out. So I'm working away from my line, slowly moving back towards my line, scooping out the material and just doing my test fits. So they're fairly tight. They could be a little bit tighter, to be honest, but as long as they hold. The person that taught me how to make these said if you flip them upside down, shake them, tap them, they don't fall out, they're good enough. Right, so to make sure everything lines up with the front leg and the back leg, I've got them both clamped into the vise together, and if I run my finger across, I'm going to use that as a gauge, and I can tell if I've got any like bumps at all. So even if it's a fraction of a millimetre off, this might rock. So it's really important that we've got this nice and level all the way across the bottom. Right, I'm going to use a tri-square to draw straight lines from these, so I'm marking onto my front so they're exactly in a line. I'm going to be using then the width of the tenons as a gauge, and if you'll notice I've striked a centre line all around this tenon on either side, so I can line that up. I'm going to flip it so it's in exactly the same place as it would be to join it together. My pencil line around. So some people use a marking knife, as that gives a registering point for the chisel. I'm going to do that, so I've got one done. Using that centre line to line up with the centre of the board that I've marked. And that way, when we join these, they're going to be right in the middle, so we won't have any sort of drastic overhangs then. So more chiselling to get these mortises fitted nice and tightly. And we're going to show you a shot then of it put together. So I've just finished cutting 3 cross beams, and I've added tenon joints onto the end of each of the cross beams. So we're going to fit these now with mortise joints into the side of the bench in order to make a really strong join. So exactly the same process as before as marking these out. So centering it on the board, and I'm going to be marking a tenon joint on the top for the top curve of the Japanese bench to fit on. So I'm going to be cutting this now on the bandsaw rather than by hand. It just speeds up the process, and you get pretty accurate results doing it this way compared to doing it by hand. So it just speeds up the workflow. So we're going to be using the bandsaw a lot more. I'm just drawing on the curve now profile of what I want the seat to look like. Again, using the bandsaw to cut the curve out. This will make it a little bit more comfortable for the seat, and we're just going to try a dry fit before gluing this all together. So I've got my joints fit nice and tight. So the next step, I'm going to glue these together. But in order to give me a really strong hold, I've done something called draw boring. So essentially I've drilled a hole in the side through the mortise joint, and I've offset that hole on the tenon joint by 2 millimeters. So when I bang in a dowel, it's going to draw this into the side which will give you a nice tight mechanical joint then, rather than just relying on the tension and glue. That's going to be really good as the wood expands outside and contracts. It'll keep it all together. So we can finally glue all this stuff together. Just using some Gorilla Glue, which is a really strong PVA, and see the amount of glue I put around the shoulders. Gives it a nice strong joint. Knocking in the dowel pins now to draw bore these together. A little tip here, if you chamfer the dowel pins with a whittling knife before hammering them in, they tend to find that hole a little bit easier and draw your pieces in easier rather than slitting anything out. Little chisel now to make sure it's level with the surface. We'll do a plane after this. So here's the example of whittling the dowels to make it easier to draw in. So I've just taken out the screws and we're going to be fixing the dowels into place rather than the screws, and a little bit of planing over the top to get them level. First time we've put this all together, just marking up some cross beams now to really improve the structure of this and tie this all in together. We're going to need to match the curves on the side to make sure that we've got a curved seat throughout. So we're going to be cutting that out on the bandsaw again, and we're going to need 2 of these in total. It's probably a little bit of overkill, but I always over-engineer a lot of my projects rather than sturdy and last than break. And to tie these together, we're going to be doing a lapped dovetail joint. So I've just marked up the tail of the dovetail, and we're going to be cutting half of it away because we're going to be using that to insert into the cross beams to create a lapped dovetail. So you can see me in the next shot marking out that lapped dovetail on the cross beams, and we're going to be chiseling those out. So I've used the saw to cut on the inside and chisel back slowly. It's quite a long process. I've just shown you the end section here. I've just cleaned up the fuzzy bits, and this is the first time fitting it. So nice and tight joint, that's what we need going across. And I need to do 4 of those in total to complete this. So you can see me just gluing it all together there, another bit of PVA glue. And we're going to be driving the lap dovetails in. So it's a stop lap dovetail, this design. So this should, in theory, keep these all together. Obviously we've got the force of the dovetail stopping it from pulling apart, and obviously the curves will match the profile of the child's seat. So it should be a comfortable seat in the end, hopefully. So next step, we're going to make some arms. So the pupils can put their arms on the side of the stool. I've just chiseled out another mortise joint so we can fit it onto the tenon of the front arm. I've also cut an angled cut to match the back profile. Now I'm quite happy with the fit, but I'm going to refine the shape of this using a spoke shave to give it a bit more of a curved Japanese look to it. I'm happy with that, so I can glue and fit these together. And do a little bit of cleanup with the PVA glue. So I'm just going to joint 2 boards now, and these boards are going to be for the top beam. So we get that Japanese curve. Just doing a pencil witness mark, so when I come to gluing it, I can put those witness marks together. Lots and lots of PVA glue rolls on and clamped up, ready to set overnight. And in order to get that curve, I've used a bit of plastic and some clamps to create the curved shape I want. And I'm just going to score a pencil line onto this and use my trusty bandsaw to cut out that curve again. Now, in order to remove the bandsaw marks, I'm going to need to use a spoke shave, and this will refine the shape and sort of blend in the corners to make it flow a little bit better. So we've got the top piece cut, and we've got this nice sort of sweeping curve. Use the spoke shaves then to blend that in with the sides, make sure there's no saw marks left. But this is ready now for some more mortise and tenon joints for the back slats to finish this thing off. Okay, the next thing I'm going to be doing is cutting out the back support. So I've done a little taper to them just to make them look a little bit nicer. Again, cut the tenon joints on the bandsaw as it really speeds up the process, and I've got 8 of these to do. And cut my angle cuts on the compound miter saw. Again, 8 of those, and lots of mortises to make, so lots of chiseling. So I'm going to do a dry fit. Always a good idea to do that before gluing to make sure everything fits together. And I'm going to have to chisel out the top now. So this is my first attempt at the dry fit, and a bit of a tense moment to see if it all come together, but thankfully, with a little bit of persuasion from the mallet, everything seemed to fit into place. Now, to make it easier to cut the mortises, I actually stuck on with a bit of sellotape the curved section I cut off with the bandsaw. Pretty happy with that as a look. So the next thing we're going to focus on is the nameplate for the centre of the bench. So I'm going to have to do some angled cuts, make some angled tenons and mortises to allow this to fit into the existing uprights. Now I did that off camera as it took me quite a little bit of time, and I'm just going to do a dry fit to make sure it all fits together before carving the pupil's name into the panel and making it look really presentable. So I've just carved the name in, and I'm going to add some curves using the bandsaw to make sure the shape of the central panel fits the sort of theme of the bench. I'm going to remove the saw marks with a spoke shave and also round the edges over so there's no sharp edges on the central panel. The mortise joints then, you can see putting them inside. Quite an awkward thing to fit this is. A little bit looser than I'd have liked, but seemed to be a tight fit when it was all together. Quite an awkward thing to put together. I'm just ripping some strips on the bandsaw for the bench slats, using a pencil to show me when it's level. I'm using the jointer. Notice I've taken the guard off the jointer so you can see how it works. I wouldn't normally do this, but it's for the camera. Run it through the thicknesser now in order to get it to a consistent thickness with all the slats going across the bench. I did that for all my slats. So just using the spoke shave to knock off the sharp corners to round them over. Absolutely love this tool, brings me back to my English longbow making days. So the final stage is now adding PVA glue and the slats to the bench. Now the glue is going to actually hold this in place, but as the glue is setting, rather than using a series of clamps, so I don't have too many, I'm going to use some pin nails just to hold it into place. So the memorial bench is all complete, and if it will take my heavy weight, it's going to be more and sturdy enough for the little ones in reception and nursery. Thank you ever so much for watching tonight's video. Hope you've got some sort of value from it. If you have, remember to hit the subscribe button down below and the thumbs up icon to show a like. I'd really appreciate that. So I hope to see you on future videos. Hope you have a great evening. Diolch yn fawr. Nos da.